Mia owned a small diner tucked away in one of those sleepy neighborhoods where everyone knew everyone. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't the kind of place you'd see in a travel guide. But it was hers. She had poured her life savings into this little spot, renting out an old building and turning it into something warm and inviting. There were only 5 tables inside, with colorful checkered tablecloths and small vases of fresh flowers. And then there was the smell. Mia's pies always filled the air, the scent so sweet it could stop a passerby in their tracks. But despite all the charm, times were tough. Fewer customers were coming in lately, and Mia was struggling to make ends meet. She worked from dawn until well past sunset, barely managing to keep the diner afloat. Some days she wondered if it was worth it. But there was always something. A kind word from a regular or a small, fleeting moment of pride that kept her going. One cold afternoon, near closing time, a man stepped into the diner. He wasn't like her usual customers. His clothes were worn and mismatched, and his face was thin and pale, with the hollow look of someone who hadn't had a proper meal in a long time. Mia didn't need to ask if he was hungry. It was written all over him. "Excuse me," he said, his voice soft, almost ashamed. I don't have any money, but if there's anything left over, I'd be grateful." For a moment, Mia hesitated. She barely had enough to cover her own expenses, and giving food away for free wasn't something she could afford to do. But as she looked at the man, she couldn't bring herself to turn him away. "Sit down," she said, gesturing to a table by the window. "I'll bring you something." The man's eyes widened with gratitude, but he didn't say much else. He sat down quietly, his hands trembling slightly as he folded them in his lap. Mia went to the kitchen and put together a plate of what she could spare. A hearty bowl of chicken soup, a slice of freshly baked bread, and a small piece of pie. She placed the food in front of him, and his expression shifted, first to disbelief, and then to something she could only describe as relief. "Thank you," he said, his voice cracking. Mia simply nodded and returned to the counter, giving him space to eat. As he took his first bite, she noticed how slowly he chewed, as though savoring every flavor. It wasn't much, but it was probably the first warm meal he'd had in days. She busied herself with cleaning up, trying not to stare, but she couldn't help but glance at him now and then. Something about him stirred a deep sense of compassion in her. Something beyond just the obvious hunger. After he finished, he stood and hesitated for a moment before walking to the counter. "I don't know how to repay you," he said, his voice heavy with sincerity. "Don't worry about it," Mia replied. "Just take care of yourself." The man nodded and turned to leave, but then he paused. Slowly, he reached into the pocket of his coat, pulled out a crumpled napkin, and placed it on the table where he had been sitting. Without another word, he walked out the door. After the man left, Mia finished wiping down the counter, but her eyes kept drifting toward the table where he'd been sitting. Something about the way he'd quietly thanked her, the way he'd folded that napkin so carefully before placing it down, lingered in her mind. It was silly, she thought. It was probably nothing, a habit maybe, or his way of saying thanks. Still, her curiosity got the better of her. She walked over to the table and picked up the napkin. At first glance, it looked like a crumpled piece of trash, but when she unfolded it, she realized it wasn't trash at all. There were words scrawled on the napkin in shaky handwriting. "Kindness costs nothing, but it can mean everything. Thank you." Underneath the note was something else. A name and a phone number. Mia stared at it, confused. Who was this man, and why had he left his contact information? For a moment, she considered tossing the napkin in the trash. After all, she didn't know him, and it wasn't like she was expecting anything in return. But something stopped her. She folded the napkin and slipped it into her apron pocket. That night, Mia couldn't stop thinking about him. The gratitude in his eyes, the weariness in his voice. It stuck with her in a way she couldn't explain. She'd always been the kind of person who believed in helping others when she could. But this felt different. The next day, she pulled the napkin out of her apron and stared at the phone number again. She debated for a long time before finally deciding to call. What could it hurt? Maybe he'd left it by accident, or maybe he'd wanted to repay her in some small way. Either way, her curiosity wouldn't let her leave it alone. She dialed the number. The phone rang 3 times before a soft, measured voice answered. "Hello." "Hi," Mia said, suddenly feeling awkward. "This might sound strange, but I think you came into my diner yesterday. You left a napkin with your number on it." There was a pause on the other end. Then the man's voice softened. "Ah, yes, I did. I wasn't sure if you'd call." "Well, here I am," she said, trying to keep the conversation light. "I wasn't sure why you left it." "I left it because I wanted to thank you," he said, "for your kindness." Mia frowned. "You already thanked me." "I meant in a bigger way," he said. "What you did, it wasn't just about food. You treated me like a person when no one else would." She didn't know what to say to that. It wasn't like she'd done anything extraordinary. She'd just given him a meal, something she wished more people would do for those in need. "I'm sure anyone else would have done the same," she said after a moment. "No," he said firmly. "They wouldn't. But you did. And that matters." His sincerity caught her off guard. She didn't know why, but something about his tone made her chest tighten. Before she could respond, he spoke again. "Listen, I know it's unusual, but would you meet with me? There's something I'd like to share with you. Something important." Mia hesitated. She barely knew this man, and the request felt strange. But at the same time, there was something genuine in his voice, something that made her feel like this wasn't just a random encounter. "All right," she said finally. "When and where?" They agreed to meet at a coffee shop a few blocks from her diner. When Mia arrived, the man was already there, sitting in a corner booth. He looked different in the daylight. His face was still thin, and his clothes were still worn, but there was a quiet strength in his posture that she hadn't noticed before. "Thank you for coming," he said as she sat down. Mia nodded, still unsure what this was all about. "So, what's this important thing you wanted to share?" He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope. It was creased and slightly worn, but when he handed it to her, his hands were steady. "What's this?" she asked, turning it over in her hands. "Open it," he said simply. Mia opened the envelope and pulled out a neatly folded piece of paper. As she unfolded it, her breath caught. It was a check made out to her name for $10,000. Her eyes darted back to him, wide with shock. "What is this? Why are you giving me this?" The man smiled faintly. "Because I can. And because you deserve it." Mia shook her head, unable to process what was happening. "I don't understand. You told me you didn't have any money. I thought you were homeless?" He finished for her. "I was. Not long ago. But my circumstances changed." He went on to explain that he'd once been a successful entrepreneur, running a tech company that had made him millions. But after a series of bad investments and personal losses, he'd lost everything. His money, his home, and even his family. For years, he'd been living on the streets, struggling to survive. "Things got so bad. I almost gave up," he admitted. "I thought the world had forgotten me. But then?" Mia prompted, still trying to wrap her head around the story. "But then, someone showed me kindness," he said. "A stranger helped me when I had nothing left. They reminded me that I was still human, still worthy of compassion." He paused, meeting her eyes. "And yesterday you did the same for me. You didn't have to, but you did. That's why I want to help you now. I got back on my feet because someone believed in me. Now I want to pay it forward." Mia stared at the check, her hands trembling. $10,000. It was more money than she'd ever seen at once. Enough to cover her debts, fix up the diner, and finally breathe a little easier. "I can't accept this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, you can," he said firmly. "Because it's not just a gift. It's a promise. A promise that your kindness will keep making a difference." Mia felt tears welling up in her eyes. For so long, she'd struggled, wondering if what she did mattered. And now, here was proof that it did. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "No," he said, smiling. "Thank you." Mia stared at the check long after the man left, his words replaying in her mind. Your kindness will keep making a difference. She had never thought of herself as someone who could change lives. She was just a diner owner, scraping by and trying to stay afloat. But now, sitting in that coffee shop with $10,000 in her hand, it hit her. Maybe the small things she did every day weren't so small after all. The next morning, she walked into her diner with a renewed sense of purpose. The check sat safely tucked away in her bag, but she hadn't deposited it yet. She wanted to think carefully about what to do with it. Paying off her debts was the obvious answer, and it would certainly help her breathe easier. But another idea began to form in the back of her mind. For now, though, it was business as usual. She brewed the coffee, prepped the day's specials, and unlocked the doors. Her regulars trickled in like clockwork. Mr. Harper, who always ordered 2 eggs sunny side up. Dana, a nurse from the clinic down the street who lived on Mia's strong coffee and blueberry muffins. And old Mrs. Connolly, who came more for the company than the food. The small rush of morning customers kept her busy, but every so often, her mind wandered back to the man. She wished she'd thought to ask more about him. His name, his story, how he'd turned his life around. All she had was his handwritten note and the extraordinary gift he'd left behind. It wasn't until the afternoon lull that Mia started to notice something strange. A young woman entered the diner, clutching a tattered purse and looking nervously around the room. Mia offered her a warm smile, but the woman hesitated before approaching the counter. "Hi," the woman said softly, her voice barely audible. Do you have anything cheap? Like, really cheap?" Mia's heart sank. She recognized the look in the woman's eyes, one she'd seen in the man from the day before. Hunger, shame, desperation. "You're hungry, aren't you?" Mia asked gently. The woman's eyes darted away, her cheeks flushing. I can pay for it," she said quickly. "I just don't have much right now." Mia shook her head. "Sit down," she said, gesturing to an empty booth. "You don't need to pay. I'll bring you something." The woman froze, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Are you sure?" "I can." "It's fine," Mia said, already moving toward the kitchen. She prepared a plate of scrambled eggs, toast, and a small salad, along with a cup of tea. As she placed it in front of the woman, she noticed the tears brimming in her eyes. "Thank you," the woman whispered, her voice cracking. "It's nothing," Mia said with a smile. "Enjoy your meal." As the woman ate, Mia found herself watching her with a strange sense of déjà vu. She remembered how the man had eaten his meal the same way, slowly, as if savoring every bite. And she remembered how his gratitude had sparked something in her, something that was now beginning to bloom into an idea. Over the next few days, something remarkable started to happen. Word spread about Mia's act of kindness. People began coming into the diner, not just her regulars but strangers too. Some came to eat, others came to thank her, and a few even left small donations, saying they wanted to support someone who was making a difference. Mia was overwhelmed by the attention. She hadn't done anything special in her mind, just fed a hungry man and treated him with dignity. But the ripples of that single act seemed to be growing into something much bigger. One afternoon, she noticed an envelope on the counter. It had no name, just the words, "For the kind-hearted owner," scrawled across the front. Inside was $200 in cash and a note that read, "You remind us all that kindness still exists. Use this however you see fit." Mia was stunned. Who had left it? Why? She had no idea. But as she stared at the envelope, the idea that had been forming in her mind suddenly solidified into a plan. She decided to use the money, not just the $200, but the $10,000 the man had given her, to start something new. It began as a simple board on the wall. Mia wrote, "Pay it forward board," in bold letters across the top, and pinned several blank index cards underneath. Each card had a small note. One free coffee for someone in need, donated by Mr. Harper. One sandwich for anyone hungry, paid for by a kind stranger. She explained the concept to her customers. Anyone who wanted to could buy a meal, a drink, or a snack for someone who couldn't afford it. They'd leave a note on the board, and anyone who needed it could take one. No questions asked. At first, Mia wasn't sure if it would catch on. She worried people might think it was silly or that no one would use it. But within a week, the board was overflowing with cards. Mr. Harper bought a full breakfast for someone and pinned it to the board. Dana left a note for 3 cups of coffee. Even Mrs. Connolly, who was on a fixed income, donated a small slice of pie. And the people who needed it, they came. Quietly, humbly, but they came. One evening, as Mia was closing up, a man walked in. He looked nervous, shifting his weight from foot to foot as he approached the counter. "Excuse me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I heard about your board." Mia smiled. "Go ahead," she said, gesturing to it. He hesitated for a moment before taking a card that read, "1 free dinner, donated by a caring customer." "Thank you," he said, his voice trembling. Mia brought him a warm plate of food, and as he ate, she felt a familiar sense of satisfaction. It wasn't about the money or the recognition. It was about making a difference, even in the smallest of ways. As she cleaned up after he left, she thought again of the man who had started it all. She didn't know if she'd ever see him again, but she hoped he'd be proud of what his act of kindness had inspired. Mia didn't feel like just a diner owner anymore. She felt like part of something bigger, something that was changing lives one meal at a time. Mia's diner was no longer just a place to grab a quick bite. It had become a beacon of hope. The Pay It Forward board became the heart of her little diner, attracting people from all walks of life. Some came to donate, others came to eat, and many came just to witness the magic of kindness in action. What amazed Mia the most was how her small gesture was creating a ripple effect. It wasn't just about feeding people anymore, it was about building a community. Customers who'd never spoken to each other before were now bonding over the board, sharing stories, and even working together to help those in need. One evening, during the dinner rush, an older gentleman stood up from his table and tapped his glass with a spoon to get everyone's attention. "I just wanted to say," he began, his voice trembling with emotion, "that what this place is doing is nothing short of extraordinary. I came in here 3 weeks ago, broke and ashamed, and I used one of those cards on the board. It was the first proper meal I'd had in days. And now that I'm back on my feet, I want to give something back." He pulled out a crisp $100 bill and handed it to Mia. The room erupted in applause, and the man, clearly overwhelmed, wiped away a tear before sitting back down. Mia thanked him, her own eyes glistening. Moments like these reminded her of why she'd started the board in the first place. But not everyone was as supportive. As the board gained attention, so did Mia's diner. Local newspapers wrote stories about her generosity, and a few bloggers even called her a real-life hero. While most of the attention was positive, not everyone was happy about her success. One day, a man in a suit walked in, his expression cold and calculating. He introduced himself as Mr. Landon, the owner of a chain of fast food restaurants in the area. "I've been hearing a lot about this place," he said, looking around with a hint of disdain. "Interesting little setup you've got here." Mia smiled politely. "Thank you. Can I help you with something?" "Actually, yes," he said, leaning against the counter. "I wanted to talk to you about this Pay It Forward thing you're doing. It's getting a lot of attention, and frankly, it's causing some problems for businesses like mine." Mia blinked, caught off guard. "Problems?" "Yes," Mr. Landon said, his tone sharp. "People are starting to expect handouts everywhere. They're coming into my restaurants asking if we do the same thing, and when we say no, they get upset. It's bad for business." Mia stared at him, trying to process what she was hearing. "I'm sorry to hear that," she said finally, "but I don't see how that's my fault." "It's not about fault," Mr. Landon said, his voice growing colder. "It's about fairness. What you're doing here might seem noble, but it's setting a precedent that small businesses like yours can't afford to maintain. And frankly, it's making the rest of us look bad." Mia clenched her jaw, her patience wearing thin. "With all due respect, Mr. Landon, this isn't about your business or mine. It's about helping people who need it. If that's bad for your image, maybe that's something you should think about." Mr. Landon's lips pressed into a thin line. He straightened up, adjusting his tie. "Just be careful," he said, his tone full of warning. "Good intentions don't always pay the bills." And with that, he left. Mia tried to shake off the encounter, but Mr. Landon's words lingered. Was she making a mistake? Was she putting too much faith in the kindness of others? Her doubts grew when the diner hit a rough patch. A sudden spike in food costs left her struggling to make ends meet again, even with the extra donations from the board. For the first time since she'd started the program, she wondered if she could keep it going. One evening, after closing up, Mia sat alone at one of the tables, staring at the nearly empty cash register. She had just enough to cover the rent for the diner, but beyond that, things were tight. Too tight. She pulled out the check the man had given her, the one for $10,000 that she still hadn't deposited. She'd been saving it, telling herself it was her safety net. But now, as she looked at the figure, she realized it might be the only thing keeping the diner afloat. Mia felt a pang of guilt. That money wasn't just hers. It was a gift meant to fuel kindness, to help others. Was using it to save her business selfish? Or was it the right thing to do if it meant she could keep the diner open and continue helping people? The question haunted her as she locked up for the night and headed home. The next morning, something happened that changed everything. Mia arrived at the diner to find a line of people outside the door. For a moment, she thought she'd mixed up her hours. Maybe she'd forgotten to unlock the doors on time, but as she got closer, she realized this wasn't just her usual crowd. There were regulars, sure, but there were also strangers, people she'd never seen before. Some were holding small envelopes, others carried bags of groceries, and a few had handwritten notes. "What's going on?" Mia asked, stepping through the crowd. Dana, her nurse regular, stepped forward with a wide grin. "We heard you were struggling," she said, "and we wanted to help." Before Mia could respond, people began stepping forward one by one, handing her donations. A young couple gave her a gift card to a local grocery store. An older man handed her an envelope stuffed with cash. A teenage boy, no older than 16, placed a box of canned goods on the counter. "I've been saving up my allowance," he said shyly. "It's not much, but I hope it helps." Mia's throat tightened as she looked at the pile of donations growing in front of her. Why are you all doing this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Because you've done so much for us?" Mrs. Connolly said, stepping forward with tears in her eyes. "You've helped this community more than you realize, Mia. Now it's our turn to help you." Mia felt tears streaming down her face. She tried to thank them, but the words wouldn't come. All she could do was smile through her tears and accept their kindness. That day, Mia realized something she'd always believed but had never truly understood. Kindness really does come full circle. With the donations, Mia was able to cover her debts and keep the diner running. The Pay It Forward board continued to grow, and so did her sense of purpose. She wasn't just a diner owner anymore. She was part of a movement, one small act of kindness at a time. And as she stood behind the counter that evening, watching a young woman take a card from the board, she thought of the man who had started it all. Wherever he was, she hoped he knew just how far his gift had gone. Mia thought she had seen the full extent of the ripple effect from her Pay It Forward board. She thought she understood how one small act of kindness could spark a wave of generosity. But what happened next proved that kindness had a way of reaching further than anyone could imagine. It started with a letter. A week after the crowd of donations saved her diner, Mia was going through the mail when she noticed an envelope addressed to her in elegant handwriting. There was no return address, just her name and the diner's location. She opened it and unfolded a single sheet of paper. "Dear Mia," it began, "I've been following the stories about your diner and the incredible kindness you've inspired. The way you've transformed your little restaurant into a haven for those in need is nothing short of extraordinary. I wanted to reach out and tell you that your story has moved me deeply." The letter went on to explain that the writer was a local philanthropist, someone who had been quietly helping small businesses and community projects for years. They had heard about Mia's efforts through the news articles and the buzz on social media and were inspired to help. The last line took her breath away. "Please accept this as a small token of my appreciation for all that you do." Inside the envelope was a check for $50,000. Mia's hands shook as she held it.
$50,000.
It was enough to not only secure her diner's future but also expand her efforts to help even more people. She sat down at one of the booths, overwhelmed. For so long, she had struggled, barely making ends meet while trying to help others. And now, because of one small act of kindness, her life and her community had been changed forever. Mia didn't waste any time putting the money to good use. She repaired the aging equipment in the kitchen, giving her staff better tools to work with. She expanded the Pay It Forward board, dedicating an entire wall to it so that more people could contribute and benefit from the program. But she didn't stop there. With the extra funds, Mia started a monthly community night, where the diner stayed open late and served free meals to anyone in need. Volunteers from the neighborhood came to help, cooking, serving, and cleaning alongside Mia and her small staff. It became a tradition, a night where people came together not just to eat but to connect. The diner, once a struggling little spot barely scraping by, had become a symbol of hope for the entire community. One evening, during one of those community nights, Mia noticed a familiar figure standing in the doorway. Her heart skipped a beat as she recognized him, the man who had started it all. He looked healthier now, his face fuller, his posture more confident. But there was no mistaking those eyes, the same ones that had looked at her with so much gratitude that day in the diner. Mia hurried over, a wide smile spreading across her face. "You came back," she said. The man smiled faintly. "I heard about everything you've been doing," he said. "I had to see it for myself." Mia gestured for him to sit, and they found a quiet corner away from the bustle of the diner. She told him everything, about the Pay It Forward board, the donations, the letter from the philanthropist, and how his single act of gratitude had transformed her life and the lives of so many others. "I don't even know how to thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. The man shook his head. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "This was all you. All I did was remind you of what you already had in you." For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, watching as volunteers served meals to families, couples, and individuals who had nowhere else to go. "It's beautiful," the man said quietly. "It is," Mia agreed. As the night went on, Mia found herself reflecting on everything that had led to this moment. She thought about how close she had come to losing the diner, how many times she had doubted herself, and how one small decision, to feed a hungry man without expecting anything in return, had changed everything. She thought about the people she'd helped, the strangers who had become friends, and the community that had rallied around her when she needed them most. And she thought about the lessons she'd learned along the way. That kindness, no matter how small, has the power to change lives. Not just for the person receiving it, but for everyone it touches. Before the man left that evening, he handed Mia a folded piece of paper. "For when you need a reminder," he said with a wink. After he was gone, Mia unfolded the paper. It was another handwritten note, just like the one he'd left the first time he came into the diner. "Kindness costs nothing, but it can mean everything. Thank you for proving that to the world." Mia smiled, slipping the note into her pocket. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. As long as she had her diner, her board, and her community, she would keep paying it forward, one act of kindness at a time.